trip over any wires. All right, have fun.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Alex Silverman, and I'm delighted to welcome Elka for this interview for our course at the New School in Sociolinguistics of Global English. And I want to extend a warm hello also to all of my students out there. And Elka, perhaps you could start by just giving people a little bit about your background, where you grew up and where you've lived since then, and what areas of expertise and special interest you have in our field.
Hi everybody, it's really exciting to be part of your group. It's always nice to be part of another community of learners, and I only had a chance to briefly, just a few minutes ago, look at your notes, and I was really impressed by the multidimensionality of your questions and also some of the background reading you have done. I am Bulgarian. Elka Todeva is the way they pronounce it, though it's very often it's anglicized a little bit. And that's where I got both my MA and my PhD in linguistics, and also English literature and simultaneous and consecutive interpretation. My PhD is in English applied linguistics. I studied as a mainstream linguist, but very soon I was much more attracted to applied linguistics and issues of second language acquisition, even though the name itself of the discipline is a misnomer, because for many people it's much more than learning a second language. For them, for many people around the world, it's their third, fourth and fifth language. And some of my special areas of interest are multilingualism, how we develop it and how we maintain in our different languages, and also to see what happens in this process of identity negotiation and develop multilinguistic systems, and how in the world we live in we negotiate our identities and our linguistic behavior when we have multiple crossings across cultures. I teach at S.I.T. And the two courses I teach are second language acquisition and applied linguistics, plus a course that is language analysis for lesson planning. And another issue that I love is social co-construction of knowledge, a Vygotskian perspective on things, and also the role of the arts, and any kind of grammar-related questions.
Okay, thank you, Elka. I just want to explain to everyone how we're going to proceed. Thank you for your input, your posts, many posts about questions you have. They're very compelling questions, very wide-ranging, as Elka mentioned. And what I have done, since many of them were multiple questions and many questions overlapped, I've tried to identify some of the main points of interest that you brought up. So I want to start with the basics and just say that, of course, there are many political and policy issues that have arisen, especially in the last 10 years or so, regarding the validity of the native speaker construct. There are implications for even hiring practices that have been very much quite controversial in our field. But I wanted to start with the basics, by which I mean the psycholinguistic reality of the constructs of native speaker and non-native speaker. So I would ask you, Elka, do you feel there is any fundamental validity in the construct of native speaker and the dichotomy that is classically presented between the native and non-native speakers?
It is, as you said, I only had a chance to briefly look at your questions, but what I liked, right away is that you were, the way the Brits love to say, you problematize this dichotomy, natives, non-native speakers. And for me personally, as a linguist and an applied linguist, this has been one of the most exciting development in recent years, that we are going beyond simplistic reductionist definitions and dichotomies, and native, non-native speakers is one of these dichotomies. One of my favorite books is, and I even brought, because I suspected that we'll mention this book, is Complexity Theory and Applied Linguistics, and Endlers and Freeman examines a number of other dichotomies, among which is the native, non-native speakers. One thing is, it is true that, there is some validity, and whenever there's been a concept, there is a good reason for the concept to have been around, and it is true, there is no denying the fact that there are some differences between the competence and performance of native and non-native speakers of a language. And two concepts, it's tricky how we can never move away from dichotomies, but one thing is there are two types of knowledge. One is procedural knowledge and developmental knowledge, that has kind of helped us, identify the differences. What is, usually pointed out that with native speakers being, people who grew up with a language, they know how to say things, they have a better sense sometimes of what sounds right or wrong, so they have the procedural knowledge, they know how to say things, but very often they lack the so-called declarative knowledge, and they cannot usually come up with a neat, easy to understand and process, explanation why things work the way they do. And this is an area where very often non-native speakers of the language, because they have had to analyze and dissect the language, the target language, and study all kinds of grammar books and take lessons. This is one area where non-native speakers are pretty good. And you go to a language class in English Applied Linguistics, and you kind of bring up the topic of conditionals, and immediately the non-natives say, okay, 3 types of conditional for a second, and here are the forms, which really draws blank stares sometimes, not always, but sometimes from some of the native speakers. And this said, again, I'm not, for this us and them thing, everybody has some advantages and certain things that we need to work on. And for me personally, that's where we complement one another in a very substantial way. But to go back to this question of native speakers, things started getting, kind of heated, because now it is a fact, after Kachru's famous, inner outer circle and Spivey circle, statistics that people have elaborated on, it is true that most of the interactions these days are, between and among non-native speakers of English. And if that's the case, so it's kind of, if now English is a true international language, unprecedented lingua franca, then it is a very legitimate question. So who owns, whose norm are we talking about? Is it the inner circle, or this common core that covers all 3 circles, all the regional varieties from American, British, Australian English, Chinese, Bulgarian, Greek, etc., etc. And so then, it becomes immediately, clear that this whole concept of native speaker of the language becomes a little problematic. And the way Kanagaraja put it a few years ago at, IATEFL, the big conference for language teachers that happens every year in England, it is really kind of a lot, there's a lot in a name, and this is an argument that Jennifer Jenkins has been making for a lot of years. So the moment we use the labels native and non-native, that kind of advantage, it gives advantages to the native speakers, because everything that has a hyphen, as if it's the second best non-native speaker, and
so it's the absence of
it's
something.
the absence of something, and I don't know if everybody in the class is familiar with Whoopi Goldberg, the actress, but she said, don't hyphenate me, don't call me an African American, so why am I'm an American, why don't we speak about European Americans and stuff? The moment somebody is hyphenated, it's hyphenated, it's kind of as if it's something lacking in the name. And there has been a strong movement, much more so in the UK and the United States, instead to start using the terms monolingual speakers of English and multilingual speakers of English, and that immediately changes the power dynamic, because now we can see that all of a sudden very often native speakers, the traditional native speakers of English, They are the ones who have a lot of food for thought, that for good teaching, they're the ones lacking multilingual skills and the ability to make cross-cultural and cross-linguistic. And for me, as I said, I again want to emphasize I'm adamantly against it. The first one to say about othering people, us and them. This is a dichotomy that has never worked in any sphere of social life, and it doesn't work in pedagogy and linguistics and anything. But it is still something, I think maybe that's a useful shift in terminology for us to consider, because if nothing else, it also invites people to work on their professional development and acknowledge that there is quite an advantage if people who are in the field of language teaching and teaching English or any other language for that matter, that the more they know about other languages and other linguistic system, the more they'll be in a position to facilitate better learning, of whatever the target language happens to be.
Okay, Elka, thank you. In your opening statement just now, you hit on a number of the questions that people had raised in their posts. But I want to return and focus in on a couple of things that you said. One is about the unprecedented nature of English as a lingua franca throughout the world, and the other thing is this idea of monolingual and multilingual speakers of English. So on the first point, what Jenkins and others have argued is that since the majority of English users in the world are now non-natives and their percentage is increasing all the time, and given also that most non-native speakers are interacting with other non-native speakers as opposed to native speakers. For example, many business meetings, as you know, in Europe occur in English, even though there is no one from the UK or the States or any other inner circle country present, the language is English. So Jenkins makes the argument very strongly that in her view, the very idea of a native norm is no longer pertinent, and that new norms based on how non-natives in a given region with given linguistic and cultural backgrounds actually speak English, those should be the new models, and there should be less dependence on inner circle models. And I wanted to get your reaction to that idea.
First of all, it is true that now the statistics is pretty clear. Most of the interaction, the overwhelming is between non-native speakers. Let's say the Toyota people who have, factories in Mexico, or, Egyptian engineers, going in other parts of the world, etc., etc. So this given, this being the fact, it does make sense that it's we need to negotiate new norms, because it's unrealistic and it's not necessary, and it takes very much a lot of effort for something that's not justifiable. And one of the books that makes this case very, maybe more strongly than Geneva Jenkins is Robin Walker. I don't know if people are aware with the teaching the pronunciation of English as an international language, or as a lingua franca, where he was saying that, one thing is we should only worry about something as long as it impacts intelligibility. Mm-hmm. If something is intelligible, then we should not worry about it. And the other thing, a lot of these questions are related to identity. I will always have my accent in English, and it's very interesting because I've always been fascinated with languages, and I have a lot under my belt, that I've studied and explored to different degrees, but I never worked on my accent because that's part of my identity, and it seems, judging from the literature, that's the same thing for a number of other people around the world. So for me personally, it makes sense for us, and it's a in linguistics and in second language acquisition, they talk about teaching and a learning progression from the core to the periphery. So if we look at the different varieties of English, American English, British, and all the other varieties from the outer and expanded circle, they all share a common core. a common core, let's say for pronunciation. In English, we all have to make distinctions between long and short vowel, bit and beat, for instance. We all have to be careful with devoicing, because God and got and all of these things, they are different. To go from, let's say, the phonological level, and then there on the lexical level, there are certain things that we have to be careful about, and then the grammatical, and then the pragmatic level. So there are things that impact intelligibility. There are other things, to go back to phonology. Let's say my P's and T's are not aspirated. So if I ask Alex to do the P's and T's, I'm sure his Peter, will be much more explosive. Well, even if I shout Peter, say Peter, for instance.
Peter.
You see how, and I, Peter, you see how much, there's no puff, because my initial P's and T's, they're not, aspirated, but this doesn't affect intelligibility, so that will always give me my accent. So my interlanguage will be totally different, but so what, it doesn't, and so a lot of people are not prepared to work on this issue if that's not in. So for me, it just kind of, if we have this common core, that serves everybody and serves much better, allows much better cross-cultural and cross-linguistic,
So, Elka,
only
who
to
would,
give an example,
Yeah.
let's say, because I think it's, because very often when we talk about, Alex, adaptation, the tacit assumption is somehow the non-natives have to do all the work. Well, if you think now with outsourcing and so many Americans going to China and Egypt and stuff, it serves everybody if we start with this common or gravitate along the, to give a little bit of an extreme example, think if you're an engineer from the south in Texas and you go to Korea, with a specific particular way of talking, it kind of, if the person goes a little bit to more neutral English, that will facilitate communication in Egypt, Korea, and all other.
So one thing you're saying, that I'm hearing you say, Elka, is that accommodation is a key principle, that since English is used by people with a huge variety of linguistic backgrounds, everyone, including, and some would say especially native speakers, need to learn to accommodate to a more neutral type of English, and which you're calling a common core. Now, the common core, how would we arrive? Do you think that that would need to be codified, for example, studied, written up, published, disseminated?
Yeah, and I think that's not actually not my idea. Several people, in the past have kind of talked about this common core. And you said everybody, especially the non-native speakers, I wouldn't put especially for anyone. I think in this one, it's like a dance. Communication is kind of a co-adaptive, kind of a mechanism where both, or whatever, how many sides involved, they need to go through some kind of adaptation. And the common core is Marco Modiano and other people have, and then this is an idea that one can see in some of, Jennifer Jenkins, writings, and Barbara's, I think, all, and the thing is that we are not there yet. I mean, these things are in the literature, and the Vienna group with Barbara and others, they are just working on this thing, but we are not completely, but we are moving in this direction to identify. And now, and one good thing is because now with corpus linguistics, we have so much data, and with the new technology, we can really superimpose and see what is really in the different, areas, what is the common core, and then start and start, kind of plan. And that's why for me this book, this is the second time I'm mentioning, the Robert Walker, because he says this is then when the common core is that kind of makes sure that we have mutual intelligibility, and it allows people to keep their identity. So I always have, because I work on my long and short vowels, but I wouldn't worry too much about, let's say, aspiration and other things. And the second, his criteria, the number one is kind of learnability. Because let's face it, we know it from second language acquisition and all the other studies that there is such a thing like a critical period hypothesis.
Right.
There are certain things that because I don't have, let's say, the aspiration, and I studied with English is one of my very late languages, it's almost unrealistic that when you start very late that I'll fully
Right.
be, you know,
Right.
and ever sound like a, but at the same time, long and short vowels, these are things that are, you know, doable and with some practice and, you know, the necessary attention.
So another example that I've read about is some people are saying in terms of the developmental challenges that people face learning certain things after the age of puberty, after the critical period. For example, the interdental fricatives in English, the and the, which many learners do not master, and they use for various substitutes that I've read. This should be perfectly acceptable, it's understandable, and it's an unreasonable burden to impose that upon people who are working, especially with English as a lingua franca. So do you think that's another valid?
And it is very interesting because when we, you know, there are a lot of very strong, I mean, this is one issue of, you know, like, shall we accept, you know, like a new target now and look at English as a lingua franca and the national language, and then that means deviating from the inner circle norms. And there's a lot of emotions around it on both sides, you know, a lot of passion involved and stuff, and people say, no way, I mean, if we change them, then within, you know, like whatever, however number of years, people, you know, just English will become, you know, incomprehensible. That has been always the argument for spelling reform, etc., etc. And there's always, because with arguments like this, there's always some truth into this whole thing. But that's why it's always also important for people to know the history of language. I mean, look at the way, you know, when language in context, English, how it simplified a lot of its ending, and we are perfectly happy without having the morphological endings for, you know, the different, you know, verbs. Also, I very often compare Spanish in Mexico with Castilian Spanish, because in Castilian Spanish, when I listen to different channels and watch television, for me it's very, my comprehension drops considerably because of the interdental. They said tengo miedo, and then look at this, you know, the conquistadors, and in the contact with the, you know, population in Mexico, the Mayan and Aztec, they dropped, and that's what happens very often in language contact situation. This is exactly the super problematic things that kind of get, you know, ousted gradually from the language. And that's the beauty of language, that it always compensates. If there is one way, there's always something that happens. I mean, look at English. I mentioned, you know, dropping of case endings. Immediately, the word order became much more strict, and then communication is still there without a particular grammatical feature being part of the system.
I just want to add, for people who probably became very curious when you were showing some of the books, that I will send an announcement out, and I'll have all the bibliographic references for the 4 books that Elka brought in today, so don't worry about not catching the titles. I would like to get into some of the political ramifications of this issue, and you've alluded to some of them already. But we did have one student who wrote in that as a non-native speaker, she has felt discriminated against, even though she has lived in the country for many years, came over as an adolescent, and has really mastered the language in all respects. And I'm not saying and has retained a slight accent from her native language. So she asked, is there a recommendation that you have for people who have felt discriminated against because they are multilingual speakers of English, and that's in evidence when they speak? And I would also like to add to that question, have you personally ever felt discriminated against because you are a non-native speaker?
That's a wonderful question, and I would like to start with some good news, that things are gradually changing. Yes, there has been discrimination in the field, and still there is. And it's not only among professionals, but also people in general, you know, lay people who really kind of look at sometimes, you know, not very favorably with people who have an accent, and immediately they jump to conclusions. And we had a very powerful student at S.I.T years ago who started her presentation at a conference. The fact that I speak with an accent doesn't mean that I think with an accent, which was, to me, was a very powerful statement to make. But the good news is that for years it is true, and if you, another one of our students did a study for his Sandinana, that's a conference that we have here, S.I.T presentation, where he really looked for a month at all the ads, and still there are a lot of ads, for job application stuff where they still want a native speaker of the language. So it's out there. We are not, kind of totally done with this kind of prejudice and discrimination.
Although I think TESOL has taken a
Exactly.
strong policy position.
That's what I was
against that.
going to say.
Yeah.
TESOL, and I think also IATEFL started working on something, maybe they already have it in place. TESOL, this is illegal. You cannot interview for a job, if you're an employer, if you have this clause, because this is discrimination, and this is something that's totally not tolerated. But it's not only because, sometimes documents are very important, critically important, but also implementation. And what is the positive thing is that I see the change on the ground. I was at a big regional conference in Mexico in October of last year, and it was very encouraging to see how many non-native speakers were hired at different universities in Mexico, because people look at people's qualification and they were not concerned at all that the person happens to be a non-native speaker of the language. Same thing one can see in Japan, and I worked myself in Japan for 5 years, and so way back, there was this kind of gradual shift away from native speakers only. Unfortunately, let's say in a place that it's kind of, I find it ironic because in so many ways South Korea is so open about things, and they're so much into innovation and exploring best practices, and still they have an official policy where if you're not a native speaker of the language, you cannot be hired to teach, English in South Korea. But look at this. This is I teased them. I was keynote there a few years ago, and I teased my wonderful host because I said, "Look at this. I was a non-native speaker, because I'm Bulgarian born, and so until a few years ago, I could not apply and teach in Korea. Now, because I have an American passport, so I can claim native speaker status. So it's the same old me with the same knowledge and some gaps in my knowledge and my accent. It's not an accent-free pronunciation, but now I can qualify and I can teach, and to me, that kind of shows that things really, need some serious reconsideration. And so, as you said, there is some hope that things are moving in the right direction.
Right. And regarding the second part of my question about have you personally experienced this?
Not on a professional level, because I was fortunate. Sometimes, the fact that I'm teaching in the United States and I'm a non-native speaker, that in itself is a testimony that, I was not discriminated against professionally. And I also taught in Germany and Norway and in Japan, and so in all these cases there was no discrimination, but I am constantly being reminded that I'm not the real thing, and sometimes I kind of I smile. Sometimes it really bothers me because the first thing people comment, where are you from, and oh, we love you. The whole range of comments range for, oh, what a lovely, and a fascinating accent, to some not so nice things, like in a store, like a year ago, somebody said, oh, go answer. They were telling a shop assistant to go in and see. There is a lady with a funny accent having some question. So it is there, and as I said, it's unfortunate because people hear the accent and they don't hear the answer, and the consequences of this are humongous. I think one thing that we as educators, we should serve as public intellectuals, because in the United States in particular, there has been this monolingual, very often, ideology. For years we were calling our students LEPs, Limited English Proficiency. LEPs, even the acronym to me also almost sounds like leprosy, instead of celebrating all the prior linguistic and prior cultural knowledge, and what has been being done in Europe, much more consistency with the plurilinguistic movement, where the way we design our classes and the new pedagogy is to tap into, you know, this trilinguistic knowledge rather than trying to squish it out of people's, you know, system and turn them into perfectly good monolinguals. The other thing that I think it's one of the most exciting recent development in applied linguistics and in the field. You know, for years, first, you know, we went through the 60s and the 70s, and it was structural linguistics, and then people saw that that's not enough, and they started talking about communicative competence with the 4 levels, the purely linguistic, the sociolinguistic, the discursive, and the strategic, when you have a problem and you find ways, strategies to compensate for the particular lexical gap or whatever it happens to be. Now we have, you know, moved even further. Claire Cramsch, she's a Berkeley professor. In 2006, she came out with a new concept. She calls it symbolic competence. So instead of only working on the communicative competence of our student, she said, look at this, most people in the world these days are multilingual. So they already have a lot of expertise. And so the goal for us in these global times is not just to have people who will be competent in the target language. It's much more, because we have this, you know, mixed communities. I mean, any place from even Vermont, there was recently somebody who has written a book about legal and illegal immigrants in tiny Vermont. When I took my citizenship exam, it was 96.7 white people state, and now it is becoming much more diverse. And so if that's the case, Cramsch talks about symbolic competence is not only acquiring the target language, but also this ability to navigate between language and culture in order to have transactional outcomes and also emotional kind of affinity develop with people. And they describe with one of her students, they you know, did a lot of data gathering in San Francisco, and they had this person, for instance, from Mexico, who was of Mayan origin, and this person who is clearly fluent in his first language and then Spanish and also English. But because when on his daily, you know, transactional things, the person will start with Chinese, you know, using Mandarin, because that will get him a better deal for all the little business. And even though his, you know, Mandarin or his Chinese is so limited, it was appreciated because it sends a message. You have this special report. And so what Cramsch is really appealing for us to discuss this, bring this in the open and see how it fits into the still overarching objective of communicative competence.
Okay, one thing that you said reminded me of another question one of the students had, and that was, the question was, do you think that you can learn a language without reference to one of the cultures of the inner circle countries where that language is native to the majority of the people? In other words, can we divorce the language and the culture, which is an idea that has been debated, as you know, for a long time. But it takes on special significance if English is being used as a lingua franca without native speakers.
I'm glad that, yeah, this is, you know, I kind of highlighted this question. As I said, I only skimmed through, you know, the list that you sent. But that is really a very interesting thing, because de facto, I don't think we can kind of ever break the language and culture nexus. Things are very, you know, intimately connected, you know, and so culture always influences, you know, language and the other way around. Because, I mean, it's to such an extent that they said anything that's significant in a culture get, in the long run, grammaticalized. You know, for instance, in Russian, it is one of these language where they have the destiny dative, I was rained upon. You know, people, there's not so much agency because of political and social, you know, conditions, and this is so much part of the experience of people that they even have a dative, like a dative, the case markings for, you know, destiny. Things happen to you because they're outside of your, you know, particular thing. So to me personally, no question that there is a very strong, you know, connection between language and culture. And now what I find particularly appealing is, again, I'll mention the plurilinguistic pedagogy approach that they have. It started in Europe, the University of Graz and other places. So the Austrians are very active, the Germans, you know, and a number of other people. The idea is always to have, let's say we are teaching English, but always to tap into students, so we are constantly having this cross-linguistic and cross-cultural experiences. For instance, I mean, if we take one of the first expressions with any language, what's your name? Even this could be a kind of a very nice object of study, because in English, what's your name? As if they said you possess it. It's kind of your name. In Russian, it's как тебя зовут. What is it other people call you? It's kind of the others are, again, you know, this kind of social dynamics in society is there. And then you can see in some languages you have the sitzen and dutzen and vu and tu, where they have the different kind of things. So right there, if we always compare things and teachers, you know, and students start, you know, serving as anthropologists, that is, to me, a much more enriching, you know, model of language pedagogy. So instead of the teacher, we love, you know, at S.I.T. Paradigm is called the I-DAO-IT triangle, you know, Hawkins triangle. So what happens in every classroom depends on what I, the teacher, bring to the table with, you know, previous experiences, background, knowledge, interest, passions, etc., etc. DAO, the students, you know, and it, which is the subject matter, but also all kinds of resources. And then, of course, you have different communities, smaller and larger communities that every classroom is part of, you know. And so, you know, if we were talking about, I just kind of am spacing out for a second about the question was, remind me,
the language and culture.
Language and culture, yes.
Connection.
So if so because very often it was the teacher who will bring things to the table and raise issues and stuff, or share things or bring materials about the let's say the target culture, you know, how we apologize, what is it we apologize for. It becomes much more interesting if that's the issues, apologies, and then everybody, what is it we apologize in America as opposed to the Japanese, as opposed to other, you know, cultures. So what is it we're doing, how it and what does it feel? Because feeling, that's one of our colleagues, Pat Moran, has this feeling dimensions, because especially when we go into pragmatics and we compare things, that's where feelings come, you know, full